Okay, so in terms of the things that we want our model to be able to pick up on in this case, we want it to be able to figure out how the patient is doing over time. So whether the patient is getting better over time or worse over time. And we also want the model to be able to figure out the best relationships between the parameters that we're measuring to get more information. So I'll give a clinical example of this. Imagine if we have a patient with respiratory failure. So they're just struggling to get enough oxygen, like coronavirus, like pneumonia. Yeah. And one of the things that doctors would want to know when predicting the length of stay is this patient getting better over time? Am I likely to be able to take them off the ventilator, in which case they don't need the ICU level support anymore? Or are they getting worse? If they're getting worse at a very fast rate, it could mean that the patient is likely to die in the next few hours. So that would also result in the model predicting a small length of stay. In terms of inter-feature relationships, sometimes the combination of parameters tells you more information than the parameters individually. So to give you one example of that, we have these two parameters, the PaO2, shown on the left here, which is the blood oxygen content, and also the FiO2, which is the inspired fraction of oxygen. So on its own, maybe the blood oxygen would tell you something about the patient. It might say if the blood oxygen is low, it could mean that the patient has respiratory failure and they're not getting enough oxygen into their lungs and into the blood. But it could also just be because you've just dropped the amount of oxygen that you're giving the patient. So if they were previously on a high amount of oxygen and then you've stopped giving them that oxygen, it may well drop for that reason. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the patient has deteriorated. So the most useful thing is actually to combine the two pieces of information together. So we can see that when we take the ratio of these, this study in 2014 found that the non-survivors tend to have a much lower ratio. So their oxygen levels in the blood is much lower for a given amount of oxygen that they're breathing in.